political education series is on Fridays. Our meetings has always been on Fridays at 6 o'clock. And now we're doing our political education with those that are going to be joining us for the People's Movement Assembly. And so our first reading, which is why we're still in April, is covering, if I can move this over a little bit, is covering a wonderful reading, section 1, the right to the city. And so we will be reading this, just for those that have missed it. We have decided to include other people to recognize the importance of this People's Movement Assembly. And so I'm going to show you the book. No, that's not the book. Uh-oh, what happened there? Show you, there it is. Show you the book, so that way you can be able to read some of it on your own. There we have it. And so this is called Rebel Cities: From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution. The beautiful thing about this is that most of these books that we will have are live or available to you. We do ask that you go, like I do, go to Marcus Bookstore or to a bookstore that is connected to the people. We are truly doing this work to get this word out to the masses. And so Richmond people, we ask you to find a bookstore that's locally mom and pop owned. If you can, is the best way, or connect with us and we will have it available through our office, which is at the CoBiz office, CoBiz Richmond, across the street from the bike cooperative. So let's go on and read this. And we have our timer just as far as wanting to make sure that we stick in our time frames tonight. So Rebel Cities: From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution. And this is by David Harvey. And we're so grateful for our comrades through People's Strike that made this available to us through some of the readings that they had this weekend from the panels that they were discussing, from the right to the city to the urban revolution. Now, what I'd like to say, just as far as looking at the contents, it's the right to the city, the urban roots of capitalist crises, the creation of urban commons, the art of rent, the reclaiming the city for anti-capitalist struggle. And then there's a chapter on London 2011, the feral capitalist hits the streets, and the hashtag OWS, the party of Wall Street meets its nemesis. And all of these is to say, we're hearing this week that Biden thinks that America is not racist. And we clearly, as BIPOC people, African-American, indigenous, immigrants, or any other, know this is not true. So the battle is, where is his privilege where he hasn't researched to show that it's been proven over and over again? And so in our cities, it is important that we connect with that. So we're going to pass, let's go right into this preface, because it's a quick read right here. So here we go. Henry Lefebvre's vision, sometime in the mid-1970s in Paris. And again, the writer for this, just so you'll remember, is right here, David Harvey, and I'm speaking in his voice. So sometime in the mid-1970s in Paris, I came across a poster put out by the ecologists, a radical new neighborhood action movement dedicated to creating a more ecological, sensitive mode of city living, depicting an alternative vision for the city, which is similar to what we're going to do here in Richmond with People's Strike's People's Movement Assembly. It was a wonderful, lucid portrait of old Paris reanimated by a neighborhood life with flowers on its balconies and squares and full of people and children, small stores and workshops open to the world, cafes galore, fountains flowing, people relishing the riverbank, community gardens here and there. Maybe I have invented most of this in my memory. Evident to time, enjoy conversations of smoke or pipe, a habit not at the time demonized, as I found to my cost when I went to an ecologist neighborhood meeting in a densely smoke-filled room. I loved the poster, but over the years, it became so tattered and torn, and I had, to my great regret, to throw it out. I wish I had it back. Somebody should reprint it. The contrast with the new Paris that was emerging and the threatening to engulf the old was dramatic. The tall building giants around the palace elite was threatening to evade the old city and clasp the hand of the awful tour and the proposed expressway down the left bank, the soulless high-rise public housing, HLMs, out of the 13th arrondissement and in the suburbs, the monopolized commodification and the streets, the plain disintegration of what had once been a vibrant neighborhood life built around artisan labor in small workshops in the marais and the crumbling buildings and the fantastic architecture falling into the streets. I found another cartoon. It showed a combined harvester crushing the gobbling away all the old neighborhoods of Paris, leaving high-rise HLMs, which is like the housing projects, I think they said, all in a neat row in its wake. I used it as a key illustration in the condition of postmodernity. Postmodernity. Paris from the early 1960s on was plainly in the midst of an existential crisis. The old could not last, but the new seemed to just too awful, soulless, and empty to contemplate. And so in a film from 1967, captures the sensibility of the moment beautifully. It depicts the married mothers engaging in a daily routine of prostitution, as much out of boredom as a financial need, against the background of an invasion of American corporate capital into Paris. The war in Vietnam, once a very French affair, but by then taken over by the Americans, a construction boom of highways and high rises, and the arrival of a mindless consumerism in the streets and stories of the city. However, Goddard's philosophical take, a kind of wistful precursor to postmodernism, in which nothing at the center of either the self or the society could possibly hold, was not for me. Okay, so this is just giving you a frank update of what he was saying in his preface. It was also in this very same year, 1967, that Henry wrote his seminal essay on the right to the city. That right, he asserted, was both a cry and a demand. The cry was a response to the existential pain of a withering crisis of everyday life in the city. The demand was really a command to look at that crisis clearly in the eye and create an alternative urban life that is less alienated, more meaningful, and playful, but as always, conflictual and dialectic, opening to becoming and encounters both fearful and pleasurable, and to the perpetual pursuit of unknowable novelty. So this goes into a little bit of that history. And again, this is the preface. And because of the time, we are going to go right to the reading. Because it's very important to connect into wherever you are sitting. Hopefully you are here where we are in Richmond, and if not, the Bay Area, and if not, the state of California, and if not, somewhere in the US where this can be connected to what you're struggling with after the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and the uprising. What is our right to the city? What is the differences between what we see on a daily basis as people, the working class and others, comparable to this notion of the president saying there is no racism? The right to the city. And here we go. Chapter 1. We live in an era when ideals of human rights have moved center stage, both politically and ethically. A lot of political energy is put into promoting and protecting and articulating their significance in the construction of a better world. For the most part, the concepts of circulating are individualistic and property-based, and as such, do nothing to challenge homogenic liberal and neoliberal market logics or neoliberal modes of legality and state action. We live in a world, after all, where the rights of private property and the profit rate trump all other notions of rights when one can think of. But there are occasions when the ideal of human rights take a collective turn, as when the rights of workers and women and gays and minorities come to the fore, a legacy of the long-standing labor movements and, for example, the 1960 civil rights movement in the United States, which was collective and had a global resonance. Such struggles for collective rights have on occasion yielded important results. Here, I want to explore another kind of collective right, that to the city of the context of a revival of interest in Henry Lefebvre's idea on the topic and the emergence of all sorts of social movements around the world that are now demanding such a right. How then can this right be defined? In the city, defined. The city, the noted urban sociologist Robert Park once wrote, is man's most consistent and on the whole, his most successful attempt to remake the world he lives in more after his heart's desire? But if the city is the world which man created, it is the world in which he is henceforth condemned to live. Thus, indirectly and without any clear sense of the nature of his task and making the city man has remade him. His Park is correct. Then in the question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from the question of what kind of people we want to be. What kind of social relations we seek. What relations to nature we cherish. What style of life we desire. What aesthetic values we hold. The right to the city is therefore far more than a right of individual or group access to the resources that the city embodies. It is a right to change and reinvent the city more after our heart's desire. It is moreover a collective rather than an individual right, since reinventing the city inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power over the processes of urbanization. The freedom to make and remake ourselves and our cities is, I want to argue, one of the most precious, yet most neglected of our human rights. How best then to exercise that right? Since, as Park avers, we have hitherto lacked any clear sense of the nature of our task, it is useful first to reflect on how we have been made and remade throughout history by an urban process impelled onwards by powerful social forces. The astonishing pace and scale of urbanization over the last 100 years means, for example, that we have been remade several times over without knowing why or how. Has this dramatic urbanization contributed to human well-being? Has it made us into better people or left us dangling into a world of enemy and alienation and anger and frustration? Have we become more monads tossed around in an urban sea? These were the sorts of questions that preoccupied all manner of 19th century commenters, such as Ingalls and Smil, and who offered perspective critiques of the urban personas then emerging in response to rapid urbanization. These days is not hard to enumerate all manner of urban discontents and anxieties, as well as excitements. In the midst of even more rapid urban transformations, yet we somehow seem to lack the stomach for systematic critique. The maelstrom of change overwhelms us even as obvious questions loom. What, for example, are we to make of the immense concentrations of wealth, privilege, and consumerism in almost all the cities of the world in the midst of what even the United Nations depicts as an exploding planet of slums? To claim the right to the city in the sense I mean it here is to claim some kind of shaping power over the process of urbanization, over the ways in which our cities are made and remade, and to do so in a fundamental and radical way. From their very inception, cities have arisen through the geographical and social concentration of a surplus product. Urbanization has always been, therefore, a class phenomena of some sort, since the surpluses have been extracted from somewhere and from somebody. While control over the use of the surplus typically lies in the hand of a few, such as a religious oligarchy or a warrior poet with imperial ambitions. This general situation persists under capitalism. Of course, but in the case, there is a rather different dynamic at work. Capitalism rests, as Marx tells us, upon the perpetual search for surplus value or profit. But to produce surplus value, capitalists have to produce a surplus product. And this means that capitalism is perpetually producing the surplus products that urbanization requires. And you all know what we're referring to and the magnitude of these products. The reverse relations also holds, and that is capitalism needs urbanization to absorb the surplus products it perpetually produces. In this way, an interconnection emerges between the development of capitalism and urbanization. Hardly surprisingly, therefore, the logistical curves of growth of capitalist output over time are broadly paralleled by the logistic curves of urbanization of the world's population. Let us look more closely at what capitalists do. Here we go. They begin the day with a certain amount of money and end the day with more of it as a profit. The next day, they have to decide what to do with the surplus money they gained the day before. They face a Faustian dilemma, reinvest to get even more money or consume their surplus away in pleasures. The coercive laws of competition force them to reinvest. Because if one does not reinvest, then another surely will. For a capitalist to remain a capitalist, some surplus must be reinvested to make even more surplus. Successful capitalists usually make more than enough both to reinvest in expansion and satisfy their lusts for pleasure. But the rest of the perpetual reinvestment is the expansion of surplus production. Even more important, it entails expansion at a common rate. Hence, all the logistical growth curves and money and capital and output and population, growth curves that attach to the history of capital accumulation. The politics of capitalism are affected by the perpetual need to find profitable terrains for capital surplus, production, and absorption. A lot of wordy stuff here, but take your time with this. In this capitalist In this, the capitalist faces a number of obstacles to continuous and trouble-free expansion. If there is a scarcity of labor and wages are too high, then either existing labor has to be disciplined. Technologically induced unemployment, or an assault on organized working class power, such as that set in motion by Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. Or those are two prime methods. Or fresh labor forces must be found by immigration, export of capital, proletarianization, or of hitherto independent elements in the population. New means of production in general and new natural resources in particular must be found. This puts increasing pressure on the natural environment to yield up the necessary raw materials and absorb the inevitable waste. The coercive laws of competition also force new technologies and organizational forms to come online all the time, since capitalists with higher productivity can outcompete those using inferior methods. Innovations define anew wants and needs and reduce the turnover time of capital and the friction of distance. This extends the geographical range over which the capitalist is free to search for expanded labor supplies and raw materials and so on. If there is not enough purchasing power in an existing market, then new markets must be found by expanding foreign trade and promoting new products and lifestyles and creating new credit instruments and debt finance state expenditures. If finally the profit rate is too low, then state regulation or ruinous competition, monopolization, mergers and acquisitions, and capital exports to fresh pastures provide ways out. If any one of the above barriers to continuous capital circulation and its expansion becomes impossible to circumvent, then capital accumulation is blocked. No, capital accumulation is blocked, and capitalists face a crisis. Capital cannot be profitably reinvested, accumulation stagnates or ceases, and capital is devalued, lost, and in some instances even physically destroyed. Devaluation can take a number of forms. Surplus commodities can be devalued or destroyed. Productive capacity and assets can be written down in value and left unemployed, or money itself can be devalued through inflation. And in a crisis, of course, labor stands to be devalued through massive unemployment. Sounds familiar? In what ways then has capitalist urbanization been driven by the need to circumvent these barriers and to expand the terrain of profitable capitalist activity? I argue here that it plays a particularly active role along with other phenomena such as military expenditures in absorbing the surplus product that capitalists are perpetually producing in their search for surplus value. Consider first the case of Second Empire Paris. The crisis of 1848 was one of the first clear crises of unemployed surplus capitalists, surplus capital and surplus labor side by side, and it was Europe-wide. It struck particularly hard in Paris, and the result was an abortive revolution on the part of unemployed workers and those bourgeois utopians who saw a social republic as the antidote to capitalist greed and inequality. The Republican bourgeoisie violently repressed the revolutionaries, but failed to resolve the crisis, right? The result was the ascent to power of Louis Bonaparte, who engineered a coup in 1851 and who proclaimed himself emperor in 1852. To survive politically, the authoritarian empire resorted to widespread political repression of alternative political movements, but he also knew that he had to deal with the capital surplus absorption problem, and this he did by announcing a vast program by infrastructurally investment both at home and abroad. Abroad, this meant the construction of railroads throughout the Europe and down into the Orient, as well as support for grand work such as the Suez Canal. At home, it meant consolidating the railroad network, building ports and harbors, draining marshes and the like. But above all, it entailed the reconfiguration of the urban infrastructure of Paris. Bonaparte brought the Heisman to Paris and to take charge of the public works in 1853. So, Heisman clearly understood that his mission was to help solve the surplus capital and unemployment problem by way of urbanization. The rebuilding of Paris absorbed huge quantities of labor and capital by the standards of time, and coupled the authoritarian suppression of the aspirations of the Parisian labor force was a primary vehicle of social stabilization. Heisman drew upon that utopian plans for reshaping Paris that had been debated in 1840s, but with one difference: he transformed the scale at which the urban process was imagined. When the architect Hitchroth showed Heisman his plans for a new boulevard, Heisman threw him back at him. He threw it back at him, saying, "Not wide enough. You have to have 40 meters wide, and I wanted 120. Heisman thought of the city on a grander scale and annexed the suburbs and redesigned whole neighborhoods rather than just bits and pieces of the urban fabric. He changed the city wholesale rather than piecemeal. To do this, he needed new financial institutions and debt instruments constructed on Saint-Simon lines. What he did, in fact, was to help resolve the capital surplus disposal problem by setting up a Keynesian, if I said that right, system of debt finance infrastructure urban improvements. The system worked very well for 15 years, and it entailed not only a transformation of urban infrastructures, but the construction of a whole new urban way of life and the construction of a new kind of urban persona. Paris became the city of light, the great center of consumption and tourism and pleasure and cafes and the department stores and the fashion industry and the grand expositions all changed the urban way of life in the ways that could absorb vast surpluses through crass consumerism, which often did traditionalists and excluded workers alike. But then in 1868, the overextended and increasingly speculative financial system and the credit structures on which it was based crashed. Heisman was forced from power. And in desperation, Napoleon III went to war against Bismarck's Germany and lost. In the vacuum that followed arose Paris Commune, one of the greatest revolutionary episodes in capitalist urban history. The Commune was wrought in part out of a nostalgia for the urban world that Heisman had destroyed, shades of 1848 revolution, and the desire to take back their city on the part of those dispossessed by Heisman's work. But the Commune was also articulated, conflictual, forward-looking visions and of alternative socialists as opposed to monopoly capitalists. Modernities, the pitted ideals of centralized hierarchy controls the Jacobean current against the decentralized anarchists and visions of popular control. In 1872, in the midst of intense recriminations over who was at fault for the loss of the Commune, there occurred the radical political break between the Marxists and the anarchists that to this day still unfortunately divides so much of the left opposition to capitalism. So fast forward now to the United States in 1942. Here we are. The capital surplus disposal problem that seemed so intractable and traceable in the 1930s, and the unemployment that went with it, was temporarily resolved by the huge mobilization for the war effort. But everyone was fearful as to what would happen after the war. Politically, the situation was dangerous. The federal government was in effect running a nationalized economy and was doing so very efficiently. And the United States was in alliance with the communist Soviet Union in the war against fascism, and strong social movements with socialist inclination had emerged in response to the desperate depression of the 1930s, and sympathizers were integrated into the war effort. We all know the subsequent history of the politics of McCarthyism and the Cold War, the abundant signs of which were there in 1942. As under Louis Bonaparte, a hefty dose of political repression was eventually called for by the ruling class of the time to reassert their power. But what of the capital surplus disposal problem? Well, in 1942, there appeared a lengthy evaluation of Haussmann's efforts in the Architectural Journal. It documented in detail what he had done that was so compelling, and attempted an analysis of his mistakes. And this analyst, the article was by none other than Robert Moses, who after World War II did to the whole New York metropolitan region, you hear me now, what Haussmann had done to Paris. That is, Moses changed the scale of thinking about the urban process, and through the system of debt financed highways and infrastructural transformations, through urbanization, and through the total re-engineering, not just of the city, but of the whole metropolitan region, he defined a way to absorb the surplus product and thereby resolve the capital surplus absorption problem. This process, when taken nationwide, as it was in all the major metropolitan centers of the United States, yet another transformation of scale, played a crucial role in the stabilization of global capitalism after World War II. This was a period when the United States could afford to power the whole global non-communist economy through running trade deficits. The urbanization of the United States was not merely a matter of new infrastructures, as in Second Empire periods. It entailed a radical transformation in lifestyles and produced a whole new way of life in which new products from suburban track housing to refrigerators and air conditioners, as well as 2 cars in the driveway and an enormous increase in the consumption of oil, all played their part in the absorption of the surplus. Suburbanization, along with militarization, thus played a critical role in helping to absorb the surplus in the post-war years. But it did so at the cost of hollowing out the central cities and leaving them bereft of a sustainable economic basis, thus producing the so-called urban crises of the 1960s, defined by revolts of impacted minorities, chiefly African American, in the inner cities who were denied access to the new prosperity. Not only were the central cities in revolt, traditionalists increasingly rallied around Jane Jacobs and sought to counter the brutal modernism of Moses's large-scale projects in New York City with a different kind of urban aesthetic that focused on local neighborhood development and on the historical preservation and ultimately gentrification of older areas. But by then the suburbs had been built, right? And the radical transformation in lifestyle that had betokened had a manner of social consequences. And in the lifestyle that this betokened had a manner of social consequences that led to leading feminists, for example, to proclaim that the suburb and its lifestyle as the locus of all their primary discontents. Now, as had happened to Haussmann, right, in Paris, a crisis began to unfold, such that Moses in New York fell from grace. And his solutions came to be seen as inappropriate and unacceptable toward the end of the 1960s. Now I'm in US in the 1960s. Stay tuned for this. Listen. And if the Heismanization of Paris had a role in explaining the dynamics of the Paris Commune, so the soulless qualities of the suburban living played a critical role in the dramatic movements of the 1968 in the United States. As discontented white middle-class students went into a phase of revolt, seeking alliances with other marginalized groups and rallying against US imperialism to create a movement to build another kind of world, including a different kind of urban experience. Though again, anarchists and libertarian currents were pitted against demands for hierarchical and centralized alternatives. Along with the 68 revolt came a financial crisis. It was partly global with the collapse of the Bretton Woods agreements, but it also originated within the credit institutions, right, that had powered the property boom in the preceding decades. This crisis gathered momentum at the end of the 1960s until the whole capitalist system crashed into a major global crisis led by the busting of the global property market bubble in 1973, followed by the fiscal bankruptcy of New York City in 1975. Do y'all remember? The dark days of the 1970s have arrived. And the question then was how to rescue capitalism from its own contradictions. In this, if history was to be any guide, the urban process was bound to play a significant role. As William Tabb showed, the working through of the New York fiscal crisis of 1975, orchestrated by an uneasy alliance between the state powers and the financial institutions, pioneered a neoliberal answer to this question. The class power of capital was to be protected at the expense of working class standards of living, while the market was deregulated to do its work. But the question then was how to revive the capacity to absorb the surpluses that capitalism must produce if it was to survive. Fast forward once again to our current conjuncture. International capitalism was on a roller coaster of regional crises and crashes, and East and Southeast Asia in 1997 to 1998, Russia in 1998, Argentina in 2001, and so on, until it experienced a global crash in 2008. Not that long ago. What has been the role of urbanization in this history? In the United States, it was accepted wisdom until 2008, that the housing market was an important stabilizer of the economy, particularly after the high tech crash of the late 1990s. The property market absorbed a great deal of the surplus capital directly through new construction, or of both inner city and suburban housing and new office spaces. While the rapid inflation of housing asset prices, backed by a profligate wave of mortgage refinancing at historically low rates of interest, it boosted the internal U.S. market for consumer goods and services. The global market was stabilized partly through U.S. urban expansion and speculation in property markets, as the U.S. ran huge trade deficits with the rest of the world, borrowing around $2 billion a day to fuel in its insatiable consumerism and the debt finance wars in Afghanistan and Iraq during the first decade of the 21st century. But the urban processes underwent into another transformation of scale. And in short, it went global. So we cannot focus merely on the US. Property market booms in Britain and in Ireland and Spain, as well as many other countries, help power the capitalist dynamic in ways that broadly paralleled that in the US. The urbanization of China over the last 20 years, as we will see in chapter 2, has been a radically different character with a heavy focus on building infrastructures. Its pace picked up enormously after a brief recession in 1997 or so. More than 100 cities have passed the 1 million population mark in the last 20 years, and small villages like Shenzhen, I'm basically saying that wrong, have become huge metropolises of 6 to 10 million people. Industrialization was the first concentrated in the special economic zones, but then rapidly diffused outwards to any municipality willing to absorb the surplus capital from abroad and plow back to its earnings into rapid expansion. Vast infrastructural projects, such as dams and highways, again, are all debt financed, all transforming the landscape. Equally vast shopping malls and science parks and airports and container ports and pleasure places of all kinds, and all manner of newly minted cultural institutions, along with gated communities and golf courses, dot the Chinese landscape in the midst of overcrowded urban dormitories for the massive labor reserves being mobilized from the impoverished rural regions that supply the migrant labor. As we shall see, the consequences of this urbanization process for the global economy and for the absorption of surplus capital have been huge. But China is only one epicenter of an urbanization process that has now been genuinely global, in part through the astonishing global integration of financial markets that use their flexibility to debt finance urban projects from Dubai to Sao Paulo, from Madrid and Mumbai to Hong Kong and London. The Chinese central bank, for example, has been active in the secondary mortgage market in the US, while Goldman Sachs has been involved in the surging property markets in Mumbai, and Hong Kong capital has invested in Baltimore. Almost every city in the world has witnessed a building boom for the rich, often of a distressingly similar character in the midst of a flood of impoverished migrants converging on cities as a rural peasantry is dispossessed through the industrialization and commercialization of agriculture. These building booms have been evident in Mexico City, Santiago, Chile, and Mumbai, Johannesburg, Seoul, Taipei, Moscow, and all over Europe, Spain's being the most dramatic, as well as the cities as the core capitalist countries as London and Los Angeles, San Diego, and New York, while more large-scale urban projects were in motion in 2007 under the billionaire Bloomberg's administration that ever before. Astonishingly spectacular and in some respects criminally absurd urbanization projects have emerged in the Middle East, in places like Dubai as a way of mopping up the capital surpluses arising from oil wealth in the most conspicuous, socially unjust, and environmentally wasteful ways possible, such as an indoor ski slope in a hot desert environment. We are here looking at yet another transformation in scale of the urban process. That's one that makes it hard to grasp that what may be going on globally is in principle similar to the processes of Haussmann from Paris, managed so expertly for a while in the Second Empire Paris. But this urbanization boom was dependent, as did all the others before it, on the construction of new financial institutions and agreements to organize the credit required to sustain. Here we go. So financial innovation set in train in 1980, particularly the securitization and packaging of local mortgage for sale to investors worldwide, and the setting up of new financial institutions to facilitate a secondary mortgage market and to hold collateralized debt obligations has played a crucial role. The benefits of this were legend. It spread risk and permitted surplus savings pools, easier access to surplus housing demand, and also by virtue of its coordination, it brought aggregate interest rates down. And while generating immense fortunes for the financial intermediates who worked these wonders, by spreading risk does not eliminate risk. Furthermore, the fact that risk can be spread so widely encourages even riskier local behaviors, because the risk can be transferred elsewhere. Without adequate risk assessment controls, the mortgage market got out of hand. And what happened to those brothers in 1867, 68, and to the fiscal of New York City in the early 1970s was then repeated in the subprime mortgage and housing asset value crisis of 2008. The crisis was concentrated in the first instance and around US cities, and through similar signs could be seen in Britain, and with particularly serious implications for low-income African Americans, talking about people like myself, right? And single head of household mothers, that's again, talking about people like myself, in the inner cities. It also affected those who were unable to afford the skyrocketing housing prices in the urban centers, particularly in the US Southwest, moved to the periphery of metropolitan areas to take up speculative built tract houses at initially easy credit rates, but who then faced escalating commuting costs with rising oil prices and soaring mortgage payments as market interest rates kicked in. This crisis, with vicious local impacts on urban life and infrastructures, whole neighborhoods in cities like Cleveland and Baltimore and Detroit had been devastated by the foreclosure wave, threatening the whole architect of the global financial system, and that triggered a major recession to boot. The parallels with the 1970s are, to put it mildly, uncanny, including the immediate easy money response of the US Federal Reserve, which is almost certain to generate strong inflationary threats, as happened in the late 1970s, sometime in the future. But the situation is far more complicated now, as it is an open question whether a serious clash in the United States can be compensated for elsewhere, for example, by China. Uneven geographical development may once again rescue the system from a totalizing global crash, as it did in the 1990s. Though it is the United States that is this time at the center of the problem. But the financial system is also much more tightly coupled temporarily than it ever was. Computer-driven split-second trading, once it does go off track, always threatens to create some great diversion in the market. It has produced incredible volatility in the stock markets that will produce a massive crisis requiring a total rethink of how finance, capital, and money markets work, including in relation to urbanization. As in all the precedings phases, this most recent radical expression of urban process has brought with it incredible transformations in lifestyles. Quality of urban life has become a commodity for those with money, as has the city itself, in a world with consumerism and tourism and cultural and knowledge-based industries, as well as perpetual resort to the economy of the speculate, have become major aspects of urban political economy, even in India and China. The postmodernist connect for encouraging the formation of market niches, both in urban lifestyle choices and in consumer habits and cultural forms, surrounds the contemporary urban experience with an aura of freedom of choice in the market. And provided you have the money and can protect yourself from the privatization of wealth distribution through burgeoning criminal activity and predatory fraudulent practices, which have everywhere else escalated. Shopping malls and multiplexes and box store proliferate, and the production of each has become big business, as do fast food and artisan marketplaces and boutique cultures. And Sharon Zucker Stop Sly notes this, pacification by cappuccino. Pacification by cappuccino. Even the incoherent, bland, and monotonous suburban tract development that continues to dominate in many areas now gets its antidote in a new urbanism movement that touts the style of community and a boutique of lifestyle as a developer produced to fulfill urban dreams. This is a world in which the neoliberal ethic of intense possessive individualism can become the template for the human personality socialization. The impacts is increasingly individualistic isolation. Let's go now to COVID. Isolation, anxiety, neurosis in the midst of one of the greatest social achievements, at least judging by its enormous scale and all embracing character, even constructed in human history for the realization of our heart's desires. But the fissures within this system are also all too evident. We increasingly live in divided, fragmented, and conflict-prone cities. How we view the world and define possibility depends on which side of the tracks we are on. Which side are you on, children? Which side of the tracks are you on, and what kinds of consumerism we have access to? In the past decades, the neoliberal turn has restored class power to rich elites. In a single year, several hedge fund managers in New York raked in $3 billion in personal remuneration. And Wall Street bonuses have soared for individuals over the last few years from around 5 million toward 50 million mark for top players. Putting real estate prices, putting real estate prices in Manhattan out of sight. 14 billionaires have emerged in Mexico since the neoliberal turn in the late 1980s. And Mexico now boasts the richest man on earth, Carlos Slim, at the same time as the incomes of the poor in the country have either stagnated or diminished. As of the end of 2009, after the worst of the crash was over, there were 115 billionaires in China, 101 in Russia, 55 in India, 52 in Germany, 32 in Britain, and 30 in Brazil, in addition to the 413 in the United States. All those figures have changed since this book was written, by the way. Do your research. The results of these increasing polarization and the distribution of wealth and power are indelibly etched into the spatial forms of our cities, which increasingly become cities of fortified fragments, of gated communities, and privatized public spaces kept under constant surveillance. The neoliberal protection of private property rights and their values becomes a humanogenic form of politics, even for the low middle class. In the developing world, in the particular, the city, and here is the quote, splitting from different separated parts with the apparent formation of many microstates, wealthy neighborhoods provided with all kinds of services, such as an exclusive schools and golf courses and tennis courts and private police patrolling the area around the clock, intertwined with illegal settlements where water is available only at the public fountains. No sanitation system exists. Electricity is pirated by a privileged few. The roads become mud streams whenever it rains, and where house sharing is the norm. Each fragment appears to live and function autonomously, sticking firmly to what it has been able to grab in the fight for survival. Under these conditions, ideals of urban identity, citizenship, and belonging, of a coherent urban politics already threatened by the spreading malice of the individualistic neoliberal ethic, became much harder to sustain. Even the idea that the city might function as a collective body politic, a site within and from which progressive social movements might emanate, appears, at least on the surface, increasingly implausible. Yet there are, in fact, all manner of urban social movements in evidence, seeking to overcome the isolations and to reshape the city in a different social image from that given by the powers of developers backed by the finance, corporate capital, and increasingly entrepreneurial-minded local state apparatus. Even relatively conservative urban administrators are seeking ways to use their powers to experiment with new ways of both producing the urban and democratizing the governance. Is there an urban alternative? And if so, from where might it be? Where might it come? Surplus absorption through the urban transformation has, however, an even darker aspect. And on this note, it is exactly 7 o'clock. We have been reading again from Rebel Cities by David Harvey. And we will footnote where we were on our next reading. We're grateful to have you all listening in. This has been, again, part of the reading for Rebel Cities weekly, Fridays weekly for those in the People's Movement Assembly through the Richmond People Strike, where we would do some reading to really include all the participants of our city. Of course, it's a lot of wordy information. We hope to bring it down to size when we have these young people who will be translating most of this information. So I take pride into being a part of those young people and urbanites that will dissect all this information. But this is our first reading, and we are grateful to have you. Please stay tuned for us again next Friday, 6 p.m.